Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. And I'm here with Jonathan Gingerich. Jonathan, welcome.
Hi.
So we kind of have an interesting story about how we got here. You submitted a paper to the APA, Eastern Conference in Savannah, a very interesting paper on freedom in video games. And I was asked to comment, and we were all ready to go, and at which point there was a huge storm. So none of us could get there. So I'm not sure what. Did you end up going to the conference ultimately, or?
No, I did not make it to Savannah.
Gotcha. Yeah, me neither. I had actually gone with my girlfriend to Savannah. We were going to hang out there after the conference, and we had taken a connecting flight, and we ended up just hanging out in New York because we were close.
Oh, yeah.
So anyways, what we're going to do in this podcast is just an informal version of what we would have done at the APA. And you're going to present the arguments in your paper, and I'll give you my comments, and then we can discuss it. So maybe we can kind of start with you giving maybe you can give us some background, your academic background, and what led you to write this article in the first place.
Yeah, so I'm a PhD student at UCLA in the philosophy department. And I've my dissertation is about it's about freedom and about experiences of freedom, with a focus on the sort of freedom that's associated with experiences of spontaneity. So the freedom that somebody has when they have the experience of being like a free spirit, or the freedom of the open road, or something like that. Um, and my dissertation works at articulating a phenomenological account of that sort of freedom, and then trying to make some interventions in contemporary moral theory and political theory to argue that lots of theories of freedom don't adequately account for spontaneous freedom. And that's sort of this project sort of developed parallel to this paper on games. I've been thinking about the aesthetics of games for years. I started out, Tina Nguyen, who's at Utah Valley University, and I started talking about games and aesthetics maybe 5 years ago. And we started thinking about ways in which sort of like the aesthetic experiences that are associated with playing games differ from other sorts of aesthetic experiences, particularly thinking about ways in which agency plays out in games in ways that are different than sort of the realization of agency in things like moral activity in everyday life. And so that led me into this literature on the value of games that's come out of moral philosophy, going back to Suits's book on games. And then more recent scholarship like Hurka and Gwen Bradford, who address and build on Suits's account to give sort of moral philosophical accounts of the value of games. It's coming out of sort of like concerns about the source of goodness for activities or actions, and that for Bradford and Hurka is maybe sort of coming out of a perfectionist theory of actions and capacities.
So how does your view so are you distinguishing between aesthetic goodness and moral goodness? What's the difference there in relation to freedom?
Well, that's maybe more of a historical point about where this paper is coming from. I I do think that I probably do want to draw a distinction between moral goodness and aesthetic goodness, um, or at least I think that there are sort of like different sorts of goods that get emphasized in aesthetic activity and in moral activity.
Gotcha. Okay.
Which isn't to say that they're like totally at odds with one another. It's just that I think that like when we're engaged in lots of aesthetic activities, the goods that we're concerned with are very different than, or at least are noticeably different from the goods that we're concerned with when we're concerned about like moral behavior, or moral regard for other people.
Gotcha.
So I think that in like lots of everyday aesthetic activity, we're concerned with questions like what's cool or what's beautiful or what's interesting or what's awesome, and and there might be some sort of connection between those questions that have to do with those normative descriptors and questions about like right and wrong actions or permissible and impermissible actions. But really the main things that we're concerned with when we're answering those questions are different questions than what we're concerned with when we ask questions like what sort of actions are permissible or impermissible.
Right. Okay. Well, some of my comments I think are going to gear somewhat towards the aesthetic side, so you can, sort of correct me when I'm misapplying morality and aesthetics with respect to goodness. But maybe what we can do now, I thought it would be kind of a cool way to, before you get into the specific arguments of your paper, maybe we could talk about this experience of freedom in general. And I do want to just read something from your paper that I think, you say, before I begin my argument, though you'll briefly explain what you mean by experiences of freedom, but then you go on to say, sometimes I have a particular airy feeling, a feeling that the world and my life lie open before me. I feel that my life could go in many different directions, that there is an infinite range of things that I could do, that the possibility space for my life is vast. I feel free. And so you sort of start there in your discussion of the feeling of freedom. And I thought maybe we could start with an example of the way we've felt that in a particular game to emphasize for any listeners kind of what we're talking about here, if you think that would work.
Yeah. So here's an example. So okay. So let me first say like a couple more words about what I think this experience is generally outside of the context of games.
Sure.
This is the experience that I was talking about a moment ago when I was talking about spontaneous freedom.
Okay.
It's this experience that's evoked by phrases like "free as a bird." It's and so I think that it's a way of experiencing your activity as at its core as not being fixed in advance by anyone's conscious reflective decisions, either your own previously made conscious reflective decisions or those of other people. And I think that so I think that this is an experience that comes up in lots of different areas of life. It can come up when you have sort of like an existential problem that you confront and resolve. It can occur when you're when you're playing or having fun, even when you aren't when there aren't any games involved. When you're just sort of like allowing your attention or your interest to just go wherever it wants to without trying to enact a plan that you've made in advance. An example that I like for how this experience can be realized in games is it's from a role-playing game called The Quiet Year, which is this it's a very simple and short sort of indie role-playing game, and let me just I've written down somewhere what the rules are for this game, and it's very short, so I'm gonna pull it up and read it.
I've written down the name The Quiet Year, so I'm going to take a look when we're done with the podcast.
Yeah. So okay. So this is a game where the setup for the game is that the players are defining the struggles of a post-apocalyptic community, and they do this by you take a blank sheet of paper, and you draw a map and tell stories about different objects that you draw on the map. And the rules say that the action of the game lasts for a year, and it says at the end of the year, the frost shepherds will come, ending the game. The rules contain no further specification of who the frost shepherds are or what this rule means. And so I think that when I played this game, one of the experiences I have is this experience of I think there are a few different experiences of freedom that I have when playing this game. One is freedom to define, together with the other players of the game, how the narrative will develop. It's sort of set up to be an intentionally pretty wide open narrative space. There are a few constraints to help you shape a narrative as you play the game. Um, but there's a lot of, there are a lot of possibilities for how that narrative will develop in the space of the game. Second, I think that there's a sense of freedom about what the objective of the game is even going to be, that you work out together with the other players. It's not exactly, so there isn't like a clear winning condition for the game. Um, there are some people who might want to say that it isn't a game because there isn't a clear thing that it would mean to win it. I think that like Sutsians would say that this is something like a game of make-believe where what it counts to win is to ensure that the story progresses in a way that makes sense within the rules of the game or something like that. But I think that part of the experience that it provides to its players is that it gives this sense of being able to decide what you're going to try to accomplish in the game. Are you going to like tell a story about how the post-apocalyptic community, I don't know, achieves triumphs of various sorts, or are you going to tell like a more tragic story or something like that? So what did it even mean to count? What would count as succeeding at the game is up for debate as you're playing it. And then the third thing is that once you've settled on what you think it means to win, or what you think it might mean to play the game well, there's still a lot of openness about different strategies that you could pursue. So say you like draw these little objects on a map, like you draw a river, and then you tell stories about things that happen along the river, and you can create sort of problems that the community who you're role playing needs to resolve. And once those problems are created, there are going to be a lot of different ways that you can resolve them. You can draw on other narrative elements that you've already inserted into the game earlier in the action, or you can kind of create new resources that the community can draw on to resolve the problems. And so there's just, I think a lot of the experience of playing this game is this ability to freely make these sorts of decisions about how the game will develop, how the story will develop, that you as you're doing, you don't have the sense that what you're doing is dictated by instrumental rationality combined with the objective of winning the game. So in that sense, I think that it can be very different from like playing a game like tic-tac-toe, where or if you're a skilled checkers player playing a game like checkers, that's effectively solved, where basically what specific moves you need to make in the game in order to best achieve your objective of winning.
Right.
Where I feel like the good of games like that isn't that they provide an experience of freedom. It maybe has to do with what Hurka thinks, that they're difficult or complex. But I think that it's going to be very difficult for a game like that to give rise to a subjective experience of freedom in a player who sort of knows strategically what you need to do exactly in order to achieve the objective of winning the game.
Yeah, I would include Tetris in that category as well. Something where maybe there's a little bit of freedom at the beginning when the blocks are coming down when it's going slower, but as you advance in levels, it's pretty much just all goal play. By which I mean just every single move is moving towards beating the game.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
There's very little room for any sense of freedom in there.
Yeah. And another interesting one is sort of like sometimes you have these two different things combined in a single game. So I'm thinking of like role playing games or like any sort of game where you have to like level up in order to activate like resources within the game.
Well, would a game like Fallout qualify for meeting a couple of those conditions of freedom? Because I don't know if you played Fallout, but in that game, you to some extent control the storyline. Like you can blow up a whole city that otherwise would be part of the game if you make the wrong choice or you make a particular choice. But also, the game itself is a sandbox game, so it affords that sort of sense of freedom of exploration as well.
Yeah, I think that sandbox games are one of the like core examples of this experience of freedom that games can provide. I think that when people play sandbox, when I play sandbox games, like, I think a lot of why I'm choosing to play that game rather than another game at the moment that I'm doing it is because I want this sort of experience of openness that comes from inhabiting that sort of illusory world where what I need to do isn't defined in advance.
Right. Have you ever played the indie game The Witness?
No, I haven't. What's that?
I think it came out in 2015, 2016, but it's really this incredible game, and I'm forgetting the designer's name now, but he's great, and it was pretty much all designed by him. But the tension between freedom and what I would call free play and goal play is just really profound. It's kind of like the original NES Zelda, where you start with nothing, and then you have to get the sword, and it sets the pace for the game. In this game, The Witness, you start with almost nothing. You have to solve these small puzzles, and then you're immediately transported into this huge, beautifully designed world, and you can go anywhere. But there are goals, and so it's kind of becomes this tension between finding these really difficult, kind of deductively oriented puzzles and solving those, and then moving on and having a more inductive sense of inferring what to do next based on the environment. And there's just this really great sense of freedom in that game. So anyways, that's an example I would point to.
Yeah, I like that, and I like that provides the combination of sort of having like goal-oriented activity with this sense of freedom, and I think that that's always like when you're playing a game, there's some constraints on like how you can behave in the game space that are different from the constraints that you have if you're just like playing around,
sure,
or something. Because there are rules that's constitutive of it being a game, I think, and the fact that there are rules means that there are certain antecedently set limits on the sorts of actions that you can take.
Right.
And so I think that when games provide this experience of freedom, they're doing this sort of like hybrid thing where they're combining that experience of constrained instrumental activity with the openness that comes from like being able to decide how the story goes or what the aim of the game is.
Right. Well, I have a sort of one of my comments to your paper here. Maybe I should wait until you go through and give the general argument, but I could insert it here. I think I'm going to wait. I actually want to give you one other example that regarding the difference between freedom out of the game and freedom in the game, and just see what you think of it before we move on. And that's I just started the game Assassin's Creed Origins, which I don't know if you're aware of. It takes place in ancient Egypt and around the end of the Ptolemaic Empire, so it's very Hellenistic, and but it's really cool. You can explore Egypt as it might have been during that time. And so I have an interesting experience here because you begin the game in a place called Siwa Oasis, which I have actually been to in real life. And so I went to Siwa about 10 years ago, and first of all, it's really hard to get to, and it was just really exhilarating, the whole process of getting there. And once I got to Siwa, it was a pretty open, unregulated place, so I was able to explore the whole area in real time, in real life, and I got that sense of exhilaration. And it was interesting when I played Assassin's Creed Origins because I began in Siwa, and they do a pretty good job of trying to make the historical place they represent pretty accurate. So I was seeing places that I had actually explored, but they were recast in a Hellenistic, sense of 2,000 years ago. So I got an even deeper sense of freedom and exhilaration in the sense that I had already been there. So that I'm not sure what the lesson is here, but there was some sense in which the sense of freedom in the real world enhanced my sense of freedom in the game world.
Yeah.
So,
that's great.
Yeah. So, anyways, I maybe that doesn't add anything to the discussion.
I think one thing that sort of highlights is that because I'm really interested in this sort of this experience that it's possible to have, and the reason that I'm interested in the experience that players have is because I'm interested in like the sorts of features that a game might have that lead players to choose to play one game rather than another game. So I'm not interested in some sort of like one question that people have when they hear this story about freedom that I'm telling is why I'm concerned with the experience rather than like the reality of the freedom. And the answer to that question in the context of games is that I think that like it's only if games are able to provide the sort of experience that it's going to play a role in why players would choose to play one game rather than another game. Um, and I think that your point about like how having been at the SOA Oasis enhances your experience of freedom in the game. I think that's like because this is an experience that I'm concerned with, the sorts of like background historical or psychological resources that you bring with you into a game are going to affect your capacity to have experiences of freedom in the game.
Gotcha.
And so, like I said, as I was saying earlier, that I think that if you know a lot about checkers, you're going to have very little possibility for experience and freedom when you play checkers because you sort of know which move you need to make to optimize your chance of winning. But I think if if you know much less about checkers, like I'm not that good at checkers, and I think that if I play it, I might have some, it's not going to be like playing one of these more open-ended narrative games, but I might have some experience of freedom in that I feel like there are multiple strategies that I can pursue that will be roughly equally effective for winning the game. But it's sort of only because I don't know more about checkers. I don't know enough about the theory of the game in order to see that one of those moves would actually be the optimal one. And so there's some openness that comes from my ignorance of the game in that context.
Right. So I'm recalling at the end of your paper, I think you made a point here that the subjective experience of the gamer and what they bring to the game does influence the extent to which they experience freedom in the game. And so, I definitely see that now. Great. Okay, so why don't we move on to your paper? I don't know if you want to. We've already touched on some of the points you make. I don't know. Maybe you just want to informally go through your argument and anything you would want to highlight.
Yeah. So I'm definitely not gonna read the paper, and
Please
we've
don't.
already talked about this some. But maybe I'll just sort of run through some of the general structure, the general shape of the argument, and if there are things you want to talk about more, we can talk about them.
Sure.
This paper is an intervention in this debate in moral philosophy about why it could be about why playing games is worthwhile, and this is I think very closely connected to a question of what makes games aesthetically successful as games. And although maybe that isn't obvious, but I think that that's because of some of the commitments that people who are writing in this area have about the nature of value. Now, in making this argument, I'm going to more or less rely on Bernard Suitz's definition of games. Bernard Suitz defines games as voluntary attempts to overcome unnecessary obstacles, where the unnecessary obstacles are are specified by the rules of the game, and you follow the rules of the game just in order to make it possible to play the game. Thomas Hurka argues that the goodness of games lies in their complexity or difficulty. And now, I think that the reason that we might think that this is an attractive view is because Hurka is interested in explaining like why it makes sense to admire people who are good at games, and I think he's maybe thinking especially of like why it's good to admire elite athletes.
Sure.
And one answer to that question is, well, they do something that is difficult. And for Hurka, difficulty is a matter of complexity, which is a matter of how many sort of sub-activities are hierarchically organized into the complex activity. And so Hurka says that when two activities are equally complex and difficult, where their complexity and difficulty add to those activities and intrinsic value, an activity that produces an intrinsically good result is superior in value to one that does not. And so games are going to be less valuable than non-game activities that aim at some that are not just voluntary attempts to overcome unnecessary obstacles, but that aim at and achieve some instrumentally valuable state of affairs.
Right.
Um, and then Hurka wants to show how games can be valuable in a way that is. So if that's off the if that way of having value is off the table for games, how can games be valuable? It's because they transform less complex activities into more complex activities by structuring less complicated sub-activities into activities in which more of those sub-activities are hierarchically arranged. And so his thought is something like, so maybe if you think about basketball or something, dribbling is not a terribly complicated activity. Shooting a ball through a hoop is maybe not a terribly complicated activity. But when you combine these activities and lots of other activities into the game of basketball with the whole structure that its rules provide, you get a much more complicated activity than any of the sub-activities individually.
Now, let me just ask, is Hurka saying that is the goodness of games, or that is he referring to the people that play games as being, that's one of the reasons why we think they're good morally, or is he talking about both?
Well, I think that he is not. I think that for Hurka, there isn't ultimately going to be a distinction between moral and non-moral value. He just has an account of value.
Gotcha. Okay.
And on his view, activities can get value from two sources. They can get value from aiming at and achieving an intrinsically worthwhile end. This is where they can get intrinsic value, I should say. If an activity aims at and achieves an intrinsically valuable end, that activity is itself intrinsically valuable. Or an activity can be intrinsically valuable by being complex, where the complexity or difficulty of an activity is an independent source of the activity's intrinsic value. And he doesn't give that full an account in his paper on this of why difficulty or complexity is a source of intrinsic value. Gwen Bradford has a recent book from 2015 titled Achievement, in which she takes a view. She's a little bit less focused on games than Hurka is, which is why I focus on Hurka in this paper rather than her. But she provides a little bit more of the foundational account of why you might think that an activity being difficult is the source of its intrinsic value. She has a different view of what difficulty is than Hurka. She thinks that difficulty is the amount of intense effort that an activity requires, rather than the complexity of the activity.
Well, then that would seem to vary considerably based on the person, where somebody could have a lot of difficulty with an activity and someone else could have very little difficulty with the same activity.
Yes, that's correct. Her view is going to lead to a lot more variability between people who carry out the same activity in terms of difficulty than Hurka's view is. And her view is that doing difficult things is a perfectionist capacity because it's something like an effective exercise of our will.
Interesting.
In a way that overcomes obstacles. And that's sort of where things bottom out for her, I think. She just thinks that this is a capacity that we would always want to have and develop. And she has sort of a naturalistic account in which she draws on Nietzsche's theory of the will to power to argue that this is a perfectionist capacity. When we accomplish when we do difficult things, we are we're sort of bringing our will into the world.
Yeah, I could almost see a virtue, that being a virtue, that people who strive for difficulty and challenge themselves in that way are, sort of reaching a deeper value. That could be a virtuous behavior, and a reason why somebody is considered of good character.
Yeah, I think that I don't know if Bradford or Hurka would disagree with. I mean, they aren't virtue theorists, and they're
Right,
instead
right.
concerned with they're instead sort of like more in the space of perfectionist moral theory. But I think that there's like a very close parallel argument about virtue um, that we could make.
Sure. Okay. So that's kind of those are the background theories that drove your paper, and then how did you apply these theories to video games and or
So
games?
my argument is actually that Hurka's view doesn't capture some of the value of video games. Um, and the thought is that so Hurka thinks that activities can be valuable either because they aim at and achieve intrinsically valuable ends, or because they make less complicated activities into more complicated activities. And he also thinks that games, by their nature, cannot aim at and achieve intrinsically valuable ends because they are, by their nature, trivial.
Right.
So that's left with the one source of value that games can have is by making less complicated activities into more complicated ones. And I want to argue that there's part of the process of game playing that doesn't have to do with how they structure sub-activities into more complicated activities, but instead has to do with the characteristic attitudes of players that they evoke. That's a source of their intrinsic value. And particularly, I think that games can give rise to experiences of freedom, where an experience of freedom is an experience of exercising your decision-making powers in context in which the operation of that decision-making power isn't necessitated or narrowly constrained by reason or duty. So just being able to sort of exercise your decision-making capacities for fun. And I think that I think that this experience of freedom is an independent source of intrinsic value. And I sort of just take that as a premise. I elsewhere develop an argument for this claim, but I think that it's reasonable to assume that this is a source of intrinsic value, because I think that as we talk about games, I think we'll see that in fact players often choose to play games because they give rise to this experience. And I think that provides us pretty good reason to assume that it's something that has some value.
Yeah, I can't remember the source now, but when I was writing on games earlier in my career, I remember coming across a number of interviews where I think social theorists had asked gamers, what do you like about games? And over and over and over again, it was the experience of freedom. They didn't always quantify it or clarify it perfectly, but they often referred to a feeling of openness or freedom in the game. I think that was Ian Bogost, actually, who did that research.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. I think I don't. I personally wouldn't need much more argument for the value of freedom, but I understand how.
I think that where the argument is going to be needed is sort of, I think perfectionist moral theorists are going to hear this and say, well, is that really like a perfectionist value, or is it really just that it's instrumentally good for some further end?
Right.
And they're gonna push on maybe like a distinction between instrumental and intrinsic value, and claim that this is in the instrumental category rather than the intrinsic category. But that's not the focus of this paper. So I don't want to maybe get into it a whole lot more.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Here.
Fair enough.
So anyway, so I think that I have a sort of a typology of how games can do this. I think that games provide their players with experiences of freedom in two ways. The first is generically, I think that all games provide this experience of freedom in a very limited respect, which is that games provide their players with an experience of freedom of playing, in that they are fully voluntary activities that players undertake for their own sake rather than to accomplish some further aim. So if I'm playing a game, when playing it, I don't regard my playing of the game as something that's required by any further end. It's this purely optional thing for me to be doing. Um, and games are a little bit different from other activities that are pursued just for their own sake, like play outside of the context of playing games, because they provide this non-instrumental framework inside of which you can undertake activities that aim instrumentally at the goal of winning the game. And so they provide sort of this framing mechanism where like when I do something in a game, my move in the game has the aim of winning the game. But it's still sort of inside this more general framework in which I experience my whole activity of playing as purely voluntary. Now, I think this is sort of this way in which games provide freedom of playing is a little bit stipulative, because it really relies on the definition of games as the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. And particularly, it relies on ruling out as games things that are done like for money or for social regard. So it's going to rule out lots of professional athletics as it's going to say that's not a game or that's not a real game. Which I think that's also Hurka's line. I think that is a little bit. I think that's. I don't know if I want to rule out those activities as games. Really.
Well, I think you could argue there that it depends. Going back to the subjectivity of the player, I mean, some players might get that sense before they play the game, and they might be doing it for the money. Others might be doing it for the enjoyment of the game, despite the money, and the money is just a side effect.
Right. I also think that, in fact, like, players' motivational states are often going to be more complicated. So, like,
Right.
maybe I play a game with a group of friends, like once a week, in order to like maintain a relationship with them, or in order to spend time together with them. And in some sense, the playing of the game is instrumental, but I'm also doing it just to have fun playing the game. And I don't know if I really can disentangle those as I'm playing the game.
Right, something like fantasy football or something like that.
Yeah. So that's the first way in which games provide an experience of freedom. The second is that games provide their players with an experience of freedom in playing, where they provide their players with the experience of experiencing their decisions that they make in pursuit of winning the game as relatively unconstrained. And this goes back to what I was saying about the quiet year earlier. I think that there are sort of I identify three different formal techniques that games can make use of in order to provide an experience of freedom in playing. One is games can provide narrative openness. They provide players with an experience of freedom about how the narrative connected with the game will develop. And that's going to include games like, I don't know, like SimCity. There are like different stories that you can structure out of the elements of the game. Second, I think games can provide strategic openness. So games can provide players with an experience of freedom about in-game decision makings, where players can pursue a variety of equally eligible options to try to win the game. So, like, examples of this are things like the range of opening strategies that are roughly equally good for winning the game in games like Go and chess. Like, you have a strategic choice about which opening you're going to use given your aim of winning. Or games that like video games that have different classes of characters, where there are different features of the different classes of characters, but all of them are about equally good at achieving the aim of winning the game. So your strategic decision about which of the classes of characters to play isn't just settled by your aim of wanting to win the game. And then third, I think that there are these games that provide openness about the objective of the game, which is why there I'm thinking of sandbox games, where the game provides us experiences of freedom about what it means to win at the game. Things like Minecraft, where what would it mean to win the game? It's not defined in the rules that constitute the game. It's sort of up for contestation by the players as they engage in the practice of play. And so these are just some of the techniques that games regularly make use of to provide experiences of freedom to their players. And I think that, players often seek out games because they provide these sorts of experiences. And when players choose to play games that provide like particularly high levels of narrative openness or strategic openness, it's often because of that experience of freedom that the games make possible that they're playing those games rather than some other game.
Right.
And so where this ends up then is an argument that Hurka's theory is incomplete because Hurka identifies the intrinsic value of activities in their complexity and the instrumental values that they aim at and accomplish. But games provide access to this experience of freedom, which is a source of intrinsic value, without aiming at it as an end that they then accomplish. It's just sort of this thing that goes along with with adopting the attitudes that come from playing a game. And so it's only as activities that players undertake without aiming at some further instrumental value that games are able to provide this experience of freedom, and that's one source of the intrinsic value of playing games. And so Hurka's theory of the value of games needs to be modified to accommodate a distinctive source of intrinsic value, which is value realized as a consequence of an activity, but not aimed at by that activity.
Sure. Okay, fair enough. So we kind of touched on this before, but one comment I would have is on the relationship between, let's just call, gameplay not connected to goals in the game free play, and gameplay connected to the goals in the game goal play. In my view, it seems like the games that offer the best sense of freedom within the game are ones that have a successful tension between free play and goal play. The ones that and let me offer some examples to support that. So, for instance, I don't know if you're familiar with the virtual environment Second Life.
Yeah.
Right, which was supposed to take the world by storm, and apparently it didn't, but I'm pretty sure it's still around. To be fair, that's not a game, but I'm just using this to emphasize the point that I don't think in that virtual environment that free play is as that the experience of free play is as valuable, because there isn't that sort of subliminal, or in the back of your mind, a sense of a goal or something to be accomplished. And on the other side of it, I don't think the value of freedom in a game like Tetris, to use the same example I used before, is as valuable, since there's too much goal play to allow for much free play. I think the games that are most successful aesthetically in this regard, I would argue, are ones that have a good tension between free play and goal play, like, say, Grand Theft Auto 5, these games where even if I'm jumping across rooftops and I'm, sniping police or whatever fun thing I'm doing in the game, in the back of my mind, I know that there's a storyline to advance, and that this virtual world has some sense of purpose to it. But if I'm doing the same thing in Second Life, to me, the experience doesn't seem to be as valuable. So let me just give you 3 different examples here. So Tetris would be... oh, wait, no, I'm sorry. That's it. That's for my next point.
Okay.
So, yeah, so what do you think of that? What do you think of that?
So I like this point. I think that what I'll say is I think that the distinctiveness of the sort of freedom that's afforded by games arises most distinctly in those games that associate instrumental goal-oriented activity with the experience of freedom. So games that have very little sort of goal-oriented activity, they might provide for the experience of freedom, but it's going to be sort of the same sort of experience of freedom that you have if you just like play or have fun outside of the context of a game.
Sure. Okay.
So you might sort of have the experience of freedom in the on the Second Life platform, but it's sort of just this like virtual platform. You can have an experience of freedom when you're having a conversation like over Skype or something.
Right. Right.
It's just this sort of technological mediation that occasions this experience that you could have also without it. The thing that makes games distinctive is that they do provide this sort of these I think they provide rules that you have to follow in pursuing whatever objectives you follow you're after, and so. I agree that I think that often like what it's going to be for a game to succeed at doing at providing access to this experience of freedom is to provide this structure of goal-oriented activity together with the experience of freedom. And that's why I think that actually like a lot. So I had this typology of like openness about the objective of the game, narrative openness, strategic openness. I think that most games that are successful in this respect are going to succeed in the areas of sort of providing strategic and narrative openness. Because I think that once the game starts being open about what the objective of playing it even is, it's going to start to fade over into sort of like just like the experience of everyday life or something.
Right.
It doesn't have rules that set it apart from what you're doing outside of the space of play. But I also think that the experience of freedom, of the freedom, I think that there's going to be a lot of continuity between the sorts of experience of freedom that come from playing games and just from playing generally.
I got you. So that sense of freedom could still be had, even in a game like Tetris, you would argue, but perhaps not as well defined as in a game that it makes more of an effort to distinguish, to afford the player some sense of free play.
Yeah, and that's also something that like, this is a point where we might have to bring in like talking about player psychology.
Yeah, you're right.
If you're really good at Tetris, I don't know, like how much freedom are you going to experience in playing it? Like,
Right.
my guess is not a whole lot. It's a lot of it is just going to be kind of like automatic, and like pattern recognition, and it seems like maybe the pleasure that the really good Tetris player is getting out of playing the game is not going to be the pleasure of experiencing freedom.
Right. Right. Yeah, and on the other side of it, you had mentioned Minecraft before. I almost see that as being. I mean, I've played Minecraft and I enjoy it, but unless I think they have story mode now, which of course would have an objective. But the original Minecraft, I mean, you just pretty much do what you want. You just build. Sometimes
Right.
people construct the Great Pyramids, and to me, that sense of freedom is less valuable than when I play Assassin's Creed Origins or the indie game I mentioned, The Witness, before.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if I want to say that it's less valuable generally. I think it is. Well, so if you can have this sort of experience outside of the context of a game or in a game, why would you play games in order to achieve it? I think because of this structure that games provide for combining instrumental activity that you take in the pursuit of goals with this experience of freedom. And so it's this sort of framing device that games provide where they allow you to undertake instrumental activity like in the frame of non-instrumental activity, that they give rise to the sort of distinctive experience of freedom that games like The Witness are going to provide.
Right. Well, I didn't mean to argue that games are better just for that or good just for that reason, but just with respect to freedom, I think to me, that's what makes that particular experience, makes games good in that respect.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, fair enough. So, my second comment would be regarding your distinction between freedom in playing and freedom of playing. And this may be my own misunderstanding of what you mean exactly by of playing, but to me, when you say freedom of playing, I'm getting that sense of it. Was it Roger Calwa who came up with the idea of the magic circle? I can't. Are you familiar with that idea, the magic circle?
Yeah, I think that it's originally from Johann Huizinga.
Huizinga, that's it. You're right.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean that is that what you're talking about by freedom of playing, like the sense of before that sense of kind of you're about to enter the magic circle.
Yeah, or you're in the magic circle.
Okay,
It's the sense that what you're doing isn't necessary.
gotcha. Okay,
It's the sense that what you're doing is play in some respect.
okay. So like a kid picking up a stick and saying, "This is a sword now," something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Okay. So I guess my question would be, how is that sense of you're about to enter the game world, so to speak, you're about to enter the magic circle. How is that different from me kind of sitting down and saying, okay, I'm about to watch Breaking Bad? Because to me, there's a similarity in the sense that I'm moving away from the seriousness of life to more non serious activity.
Yeah, I think that it might ultimately be the same. Um, uh, I think that this is sort of a my claim about the freedom of playing is a conceptual claim about the nature of games as conceived by Suits and Hurka.
Gotcha. Okay.
Where they've sort of not entirely stipulatively, but somewhat stipulatively defined games as these voluntary attempts to overcome unnecessary obstacles.
Gotcha.
And I think that there are people who work on Suits who are concerned about delineating the precise boundaries of what counts as a game in that sense. And I think that, I mean, like, even so for Suits, like, philosophical inquiry can count as a game.
Okay.
And so once you adopt this sort of stipulative definition of games, you end up with a really capacious understanding of what a game is. And it might just be that it includes lots and lots of aesthetic activities, like watching TV. Or at least undertaken with the right sort of mindset. So I think that that it probably I think in the end the freedom of playing is going to be the same as the freedom of sitting down and watching Breaking Bad.
Gotcha. Okay.
It's just this sort of like framing in the background that leads me to understand my activity as voluntary and unnecessary.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, so I guess I mean, considering that this is sort of part of a conceptual response to Hurka, I don't know if my objection here, it's not really an objection, but I guess what I would say is that this doesn't really contradict your argument, but I would emphasize that since freedom of playing seems to share so many features with other media, I would argue that in emphasizing the goodness of freedom within games, we should emphasize freedom in playing, because that's sort of where they really distinguish themselves from other media. I mean, I can't remember the name of the theorist, but one theorist refers to games as providing a participatory aesthetics that other media don't provide. I mean, just to put it simply, I can't become Luke Skywalker when I watch Star Wars, but I can when I play the Star Wars game. So to me, the freedom, the most important part of the freedom in games would be the freedom in playing. And I just wanted to give a couple examples to see what you think of these. So here's the first example, and again, I'm going to be a bad philosopher and use the same damn example again, but here's Tetris again. So Tetris gives us an example of freedom of playing, right? You get that sense of you come home from work and you're entering the magic circle, you're going to play some Tetris, but there's little freedom in playing. But then imagine a case of a game tester who is, that's his job, so there's no real freedom of playing because he has to play the game. But nevertheless, let's say he's playing Grand Theft Auto 5 or Assassin's Creed Origins or the indie game you mentioned. Once he starts playing, he gets the sense of freedom in playing. And then the third example would be somebody who chooses to play, GTA 5, where there's both freedom of playing and freedom in playing. And I guess my point would be that these examples seem to illustrate that in-game freedom is a more valuable part of the freedom with respect to games.
I think that I generally agree with that. Well, I guess what I want to say is that the freedom of playing and the freedom in playing help answer slightly different questions about games.
Okay.
I think that the freedom of playing helps to answer the question, why play games?
Gotcha.
The
Okay.
freedom in playing helps answer the question, why play this game? Or which of these two games should I play right now? Because of its sort of stipulative nature, the freedom of playing is something that just applies to everything that counts as a game. It's not contrastive as applied to different games. But different games are going to provide freedom in playing to different extents and in different ways. And so that's going to be the useful category for like engaging in aesthetic criticism of games, for instance. And I think that and I also agree that it's going to be, it's going to do a little bit more to help distinguish what's going on in games from like watching Breaking Bad.
Right. I see. Okay, yeah, and I guess, I mean, you could also argue that freedom, even if freedom of playing is somewhat more peripheral, I mean, it's still part of the general sense of, freedom within, and especially when you couple that with the freedom in playing, then that sense, together, it gives you an overall sense of freedom that you don't get with other media.
Yeah, yeah.
Interesting. Well, okay. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, Jonathan. I really appreciate you talking with me about this. It's been an interesting conversation. But maybe I'm curious what you think about this. This is just something interesting. Have you read Ender's Game?
Yes, I have.
So what do you think about that? I think I sent you my comments with that. I mean, that's a case where,
Yeah.
spoiler alert, where a kid is playing a game and he ends up saving the human race from aliens, but he didn't know he was doing that. So that's a case where game playing did lead to an intrinsic good. So I'm wondering, what do you think Hurka would say?
Yeah, so I actually have a very specific answer about this, which is that, so in Ender's Game, the players of the game are not aiming at some further instrumental good.
That makes
they're
sense.
aiming at winning the game. And in Hurka's view, an activity achieves further intrinsic value not when it achieves some further good, but when it aims at and achieves some further good. So the aiming at is necessary for the activity to partake of the value of the end at which it aims.
Got it.
So the adults in Ender's Game might aim at some further good by having the kids play the game, but I don't think that the adults are playing a game. And for the game players, the kids who are playing the game won't qualify. I also think that for them, like the game might still not qualify as a pure activity of gameplay because of all the external incentives.
Right.
Playing the game. It's like, in some sense it's a game, but it's in some sense like there's all of this like social regard and prestige that rides on doing well at it. And so that makes it a little bit ambiguous whether it even is a game.
Yeah, it definitely enters into the real world more so than any other game would.
Yeah. But I also, I appreciate, like, there is some ordinary language sense in which it does seem to count as a game. And it maybe provides, like, strategic openness. There's room for, like, innovation about how you play the game. And maybe that provides at least some sort of residual sense of freedom to its players. But for Hurka anyway, the intrinsic good, or the instrumental good of the game isn't going to add to its intrinsic value for the players who don't know about and aim at that good.
Right. Well, that's a good answer. It seems like too easy of an answer. I thought that was more of an interesting case that would challenge Hurka. But you're right. If they're not aiming at that intrinsic good, then it's off the table.
I mean, maybe it shouldn't be. I don't know. Like, in some sense, what I'm saying is that there are intrinsic goods that can be achieved by participating in an activity when the activity brings about those goods without aiming at them. And so maybe the case is trickier for me than for Hurka. Probably what I want to say is that I'm defending this sort of this intrinsic good that comes from the process of playing a game. It's a good that comes directly out of the process of playing,
right?
Rather than some disconnected further good that it achieves.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, that is the core of your argument against Hurka, or not argument against him, but your argument for the modification is that freedom, it's not the complexity. That's not where the intrinsic good comes from.
Yeah.
So great.
Yeah.
Well, all right, Jonathan.
Well, so I should also say I'm pleased to say that this paper is now forthcoming in the Canadian Journal of Philosophy.
Great. Oh, that's great. Yeah. Send me the link, and when I post this podcast, I'll put up the information.
Great. I will do that.
Good to hear. All right. Thanks again, Jonathan.
Yeah, this was really fun. Thank you for doing this, and I'm glad that we were able to talk, even though we couldn't make it to Savannah.
Yeah, no, it's great. I was so, it's been a while since I thought about games, and your paper really interested me, and so I knew we had to do it in some way, whether there was weather or not. All right. Well, I'll catch you later then, Jonathan.
Okay. Thanks very much.
All right.